Professor Gran.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Allen, for the invitation. Thank you, Yussef, for considering me. I don't think Libyan subject matter is well rooted in the American Academy. Perhaps this is a university which is something of an exception. But so that what I wrote was a bit more long-winded and a bit more subconscious than it might be if I felt that I was sort of appealing to subjects which everybody would agree on, or everybody would perhaps at least be familiar with the perspectives that someone might have. So what I thought I'd do in light of the condensation of time is make a beginning, introduce what my main areas are, and if these are of interest, then I'm happy to sort of elaborate them in the discussion. So I introduced myself. I'm a historian who spent a good deal of time in Egypt since the late 60s. And twice I was able to work in Libya in the 70s as a guest of the Libyan Studies Center, directed by the young Dr. Mohammed Jarari. As a historian, I've always been a bit frustrated by the way that the history of these two countries has been written, and I believe it influences the strategy being adopted by people in the who we read about today in current events. So I called my paper Libya and Egypt, the historical background to the contemporary moment. And so I'm using the opportunity of the contemporary moment to talk critically about history. My perception is that the history as it's written about Libya and also about Egypt is frozen conceptually in the colonial past. So I come to this evening's events thinking perhaps we're living in a moment which might encourage some rethinking of the past because of the unexpected nature of these current events. And however one might want to choose to go about it, to better address the question of how did this past lead up to this present, which I think under present conditions is paradoxical. Perhaps, in other words, the goal ought to be able to think of some kind of approach to Libyan history which would be useful to the people who are currently protesting autocracy, and the same with Egypt. So what I'm assuming from the outset is that much of the historical work produced about these two countries remains, in the case of Egypt, in the framework of Oriental despotism, and in the framework of Libya, that Libya is not a real state. And as a result, for reasons I'm going to explain, maybe not explain, but would explain were you to ask me to explain, it contributes very little to the present day needs. In the case of both countries, what one typically can find are accounts of the coming of the West, and thereafter of attempts on the part of Europeans to make a nation state in the form and manner that they find appealing to their sensibilities. Following independence, the Europeans depart, and then failure follows failure. More than one historian notes in passing that the subject matter is difficult, or does not make a great deal of sense. And this is what I'm calling colonial history, whether it's written in English, Italian, French, or even Arabic. Why people choose to continue to write history this way is a significant subject in its own right, perhaps more significant than the one I set for myself for this evening. I don't fully know why they do. In any case, I'd be interested to hear anyone's views on this subject. The subject aside for this evening, however, is one of attempting to sort of think in terms of what one would have to do to make these histories a bit more relevant. And I want to do this without privileging these two countries' experiences, even though they're in the forefront of today's news. My sense is that they share a great deal with other countries, and that they've suffered too much from notions of exceptionalism in the past. And I don't either want to spend the evening criticizing the works of colleagues, as I'm quite aware of how difficult the conditions are working in these countries for either people who live there all the time or people who try to come and work as outsiders. To decolonize the history of these countries, and I use this word in strong preference to post-colonial or other notions, to decolonize the history of these two countries, which is a term you could hear in Libya in the 70s anyway. My surmise is that in both cases, there would need to be a major overhaul of the theorization of modern history. I'd go so far as to suggest that if this could be achieved, it might very well turn out to be the key to connect this history in a useful way to more recent developments. As I implied, up to this point, most of Libyan history and a great deal of Egyptian history is the story of European actors. The periodization we make use of emphasizes what they did, and so perhaps inadvertently, perhaps not, we've turned Libyans and Egyptians, in many cases, or at least the mass population, into spectators of their own history. I'm aware of the fact that pursuing the direction I'm suggesting we pursue, that is focusing on the internal logic of the local ruler and rule and the larger numbers of people, and imagining their historical agency, opens up some quite unpleasant subjects. Dr. Ali already suggested one, and he is among those who has taken the lead in trying to do this in this country. As, for example, once Libyan and Egyptian subjects, Egyptians become the subject of their own history, all kinds of subjects come out of the woodwork. In the Libyan case, we have to come to grips with what Yussef said, to recall that Italians killed a very significant percentage of the entire population, and then you could add to this, the Americans came along to plunder the oil. And while there's some need to cover this over, and this may be part of the explanation for why the field is prevented from decolonizing, there's doubtless more to it than that. I think, however, not just for scientific reasons, but politically speaking, as the planet's resources keep shrinking, and as the future draws us closer together as a result of that fact, a country's survival may well hinge on a more realistic knowledge of itself, for better or for worse. And this would trump any short-term benefit of saving face. I'd make the same point to the postmodernists in this country, and exactly the same criticism. Many of them seem to want to defend the United States by getting the subject of Iraqi national history, or Guantanamo, or Afghanistan's national history off the radar screen, perhaps to shield America's reputation by ruling out history as an approach to knowledge. However, I think it's too late in human history for this to be a good idea either. So it's not simply the problems of Libyan and Egyptian studies. I think that there's a wider tendency of an empire in decline, in some senses, to run away from the study of history. Columbia being famous in terms of the development of the studies of American studies and American history, this seems to be a place where I'm hoping for a good round of applause. Right? There's more to Columbia than that. Okay, well, that confirms the stereotype I wanted to have confirmed. Of course, I should also then add, and this would apply to our country here, no country likes historians going through archives, but historians have been pretty good at making the case that the likely benefits more than outweigh the negative potentialities. Historians have been doing this for a while, and they can do it again. In Libya, the individual I mentioned, Mohammed Jarari, can do this. In Egypt, historians like Ahmad Su'i can do this. And it seems perfectly logical to me to make this as an argument that, and a priority, that knowledge of national history creates a level of self-understanding that's indispensable for society, which has to, even in the short term, compete internationally. Never mind what will come in the long term, although certainly the value of studying history is much greater than simply our fears about the future. Now, proceeding from these assumptions, I'm going to turn to the theme of thinking or rethinking the historical background of the present moment. And I want to do so emphasizing two areas which I think stand in need of revision, and one being from the early modern period and one being from the modern period. And then I had intended, by way of conclusion, to sort of then link what I had to say to the current events. But as time will permit, I think I will blunder on into the subject of early modern history. This is not a subject which is familiar even to students who spend a good deal of time, and there are very few books on the period of Libyan history, 16th, 17th, 18th century. A few basically in Arabic and cursory treatments in English. However, as a general principle, if you study the history of a variety of different countries, you would find that the more developed the historiographical tradition becomes, the more likely it is that historians discover a link between the early modern period and the modern period in terms of their discussions of modernity. In In other words, it's more a function of the development of the history profession than it is some unique feature of the country itself. This can be shown in about 20 or 30 or 40 cases right now in the world, and these are the places where historians have been privileged to work in a systematic way. So I'm assuming were Libyan studies to be elevated and gotten out of this sort of marginal position, discoveries of this sort could be produced. What we do now know is from work done on North Africa in general, a little on Libya, some on Egypt, is that in the early modern period, the Arab world, including North Africa, was a collection of city-states and agricultural hinterlands bound together often through trade routes. Samir Amin called this the Arab nation. The Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, which has received so much attention in Middle East studies, was, for the most part, quite remote. Its personnel, however, often basically soldiers of fortune, blended into the countries I'm referring to, that they were sent to. And so the word Ottoman, it gets used quite a bit in our studies, where it would be more precise for us to use the word ex-Ottoman. That term I've never heard used, but I think it would be a better term. I now move to try to sort of pursue Samir Amin's description and refer to the world as a whole. And this, of course, was Janet Abou-Lughod picked up in her book. It was sort of an archipelago of city-states along the trade routes, and the Arab world is famous for this. All we can say at the moment is that the trajectory of this archipelago is different than the trajectory of the one we're familiar with, starting out in Renaissance Europe. Both had cities along trade routes, but in the case of Europe, what one notices is that the trade routes bypassed large parts of Europe which were not so commercialized. Europe had highly capitalized places, and these were very commercial, and they had feudal backwaters all over. Whereas in the Arab world, virtually all the cities were connected with merchants, and merchants and artisans were a dominant force. These differences are reflected in language development and I believe also literature development. The Europeans evolved separate national languages which all shared a common base in Latin, while the Arab world kept evolving a common language and a kind of Protean Arabism which would go with it. One could attribute this, here to repeat, to the more homogeneously commercial economies of the Arab cities. Another general feature of early modern times, how am I doing?
You're doing okay?
Commandant? Adieu.
You've got about 10 minutes.
Another generalized feature of the early modern period, which I believe is so general that one should apply to here as well, and I get this from the book I wrote, Rise of the Rich, which was my latest adventure in criticizing sort of Orientalism, is that the early modern political economy was mercantilist. In other words, it was a economic strategy which took a variety of political forms around the world to allow for a certain amount of international trade while protecting the home market and the political stability of the country. And in fact, such regimes or systems were common throughout the Arab world. And we know them best from economic history, but in terms of hoarding money, in terms of opening and closing markets, but basically I think one should move quickly from the economic to the political and note that the roots of modern history came out of the struggles in different kinds of mercantilist regimes. Barrington Moore's old writing points in that way. So that a variety of systems, each with their pirates and their markets which could keep foreigners out, and here you would include Libya, were the common feature of early modern times. A book by Peter Lamborn Wilson talks a little about this, the commonality of the early modern period. And this was, here to repeat, a general trend. So what I'm saying, I believe would apply, from what we know, to Libya and Egypt. That is, Libya and Egypt should be regarded as mainstream history as France or Italy or Spain in this time frame. Specific ideas about decline, isolation, stagnation, so often applied to the study of Arab countries, seem to me to be simply a priori value judgments related more to the rise of the West paradigm than to any specific knowledge. But I think that the thing to say to scholars who use these is that it's your obligation to say what a country is and not what you think it isn't, or what you think it's lacking. So I believe this would be the place to look for the origins of Libyan modernity. And I think that the rise and decline of mercantilism is the biggest event for centuries in Libyan history, and it's related basically to the Senussis, who basically their coming more greater prominence at a certain period changed the political equilibrium. And what is known is that Libyan merchants were famous internationally, and they're called Magharaba, and I saw a great deal of evidence of them in Egypt. And increasingly we know a bit about the trade routes that they followed and so on. And so if we can study, it seems to me, Genoa and Italian merchants after the Renaissance and so forth, studying the Libyan material is not necessarily going to be any more strange or difficult for us to do. It's a question of going more deeply into our own psychology about what it is about Libya that has made Libya invisible for us. In other words, what do we gain culturally, psychologically, over the long term by not having Libya as part of our sort of psychological map? That's the more complicated question. So part two, as we arrive at the 19th century, Egypt and Libya become more distinct from one another on a political level. I'll rush into this as if this was familiar. Where Libya still managed to keep the old trade routes functioning, and the Europeans were kept out, or kept somewhat marginal. In Egypt, it was the reverse. In the crucial period, 1780, 1815, as I wrote about in Islamic Roots, what happened was that the Egyptian bourgeois classes entered into the European markets, buying its luxury goods, coming to depend on its weapons, exporting their own raw goods that had early been crucial to their own urban artisanal economy. As this was taking place, the country became divided in a new way, from a setup of different centers, each at a distance from one another, Cairo being primus inter pares, and this was the old system called Sanjaks or Sanagic, and this was the setup in Libya and many other places. A new system arose, one giving some measure of hegemony to a more capitalist north of the country over a more feudal south of the country, Cairo becoming the midpoint between these two regions. The north over south form a rule, which was then apparent, was to deepen over the years, a point I'm going to return to when I talked about the Maltajiin, the thugs, and the Egyptian police. There, the regional question, which emerges in this period, 1780, 1815, comes to the surface and explains the curious relationship between Maidan Tahrir and the lower levels of the Egyptian police. Now, coming up to the era of colonialism, it is perhaps something of almost of a distraction that in Libya, the system prevailing, which was one, as I told you, of regions of clans, of extended familial groupings, had superimposed on it an Italian idea of a central state. And where if there was going to be, in fact, a kind of common denominator in all this, the gender question was starting to emerge. It was, gender and class were starting to emerge. But in a certain sort of sense, this was not the Italian approach. And so first Ottomans and then Italians tried to impose the central authority. The harder they tried, the more insane it was. In conclusion, I'll try to connect this point of insanity or erratic behavior to the Muammar al-Gaddafi today and the centralism. In other words, I think that some of what we call the craziness of Gaddafi could be interpreted in a kind of historical and structural sense. I don't think it can be made in the sort of narrow psychological sense of an individual who's purely seeking power. This might be some component of it, but I think there's different kinds of insanity. And the behavior and the sort of disconnectedness of this individual, what I think you see are some of the structural contradictions which go with attempting centralism in a context in which the logic of the society precludes that sort of centralism. So I now would say in Egypt, the British gave up basically their idea that they had an Oriental despotism in place with the breakdown of the protectorate and the coming of the 1923 Constitution, which for them reluctantly sort of pointed the way to their own departure. Now, to conclude this section on rethinking the origins of modernity, it's important to recall once more what I'm challenging. To make Libyan history Libyan, one has to challenge the idea of the coming of the West, and then one has to challenge what is normally considered to be a modern form of state, that is, the Western form of state, which is taken to be a particular form of state. And these are all really very primitive ideas rooted in one or two attributes of what are taken to be states without reference to the way in which stratification, in other words, to understand deeply what a state is, you have to understand how do rulers keep all the wealth and play poor people against each other and basically destroy the middle class. This strategy of what's called maintaining stratification is the way in which you tell what a hegemony is. To say there are elections or a constitution or laws or no laws doesn't tell you really a great deal. It's how do a few people manage to keep power and wealth, and how do they manage to keep poor people basically at each other's throats. So basically, when we're talking about a discussion of modernity, tribal ethnic states, which is the word in political anthropology for better or worse, is a form of modern hegemony parallel to that of the United States, which is a bourgeois democracy. In other words, as a structure, it works. Like our structure works. In other words, we can keep poor people in this country played off against each other, and this stabilizes wealth. So we have a stable system, and many other countries in the world do as well. But historians do not care for this. Historians, particularly in the Western countries, maintain that only countries shaped like the United States, in other words, with structural racism, are modern. In tribal ethnic states or kit-based states, they associate with weak states, even though the term weak state really doesn't mean anything. And with primitivism, a term which also doesn't mean anything, or with non-state, another term which doesn't mean anything. But in any case, whatever they're using, these are opposites to the notion of what is called modern state, in other words, the state form that they're most familiar with. This is what you will contend with, and I think this is where Libyan studies has to sort of become somehow, develop the skills of being able to argue with this. What we know is that the decentralization found in tribal ethnic states appears to threaten people in countries like our own, where the norm is the centralized state. Now, is it because of the genocide of the indigenous population, which were also of this sort? Who's to say? But direct democracy, or deciding for oneself, as opposed to electoral democracy, voting for someone to decide for you, perhaps even creates for scholars a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, and they can't control themselves. This too is an interesting psychological problem.
Well, I can't control myself too much longer. I think I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up, and we'll move on.
Not my first such experience.
Thank you so much.